Welcome to Ithaca Politics. Ithaca's 3rd Ward ranges from the South Hill to parts of East Hill, bordered by Cornell University and Ithaca College. Tonight, we have 2 candidates that are vying for representation on council for the 3rd Ward, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. Pat, would you like to go ahead and start?
Sure. Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. My name's Pat Sewell. I ran 2 years ago as an independent, and I'm running now as a Democratic nominee. And should I explain why I'm running, or just brief introduction?
Sure, if you'd like to explain your platform a little bit.
Well, I was just going to say
the
reason why I was running is it wasn't really on my radar, but when it became more clear that our current alderperson was stepping down and not going to run again, a number of folks in the ward approached me and asked me to run for the position because I had talked to them previously in my last run, and also in some work I had done in canvassing for a ranked choice voting project. And so they liked me. They felt like I would be a good representative for the ward, and so I thought about it seriously. I decided to run again, and I would have run as a Democrat previously, but I missed the timeline, and so I ended up running as an independent. But I'm really happy to be able to be a candidate for the Democratic nomination.
Okay. And Billy, if you'd like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom. My name is Billy Noseworthy. I am also running as a Democratic Party candidate for the 3rd Ward for Common Council. I am a library worker at Cornell University, and my wife and I had just bought a house in Bell Sherman a couple years back. And when I think about why I'm running, everybody kind of has the one issue that really puts them out there if you really drill down and talk to them. And for me, that was housing affordability. That's the one issue that will motivate me to get out and knock doors on February on the first day of signature gathering. And just to build off of that a little bit, I think that in discussions with many people in the ward, there's been a real sense that folks would like both the Democratic Party and also the council to be very responsive to voters. So what I did in terms of constructing a platform was I tossed out the idea of me creating the platform full cloth by myself, and I just walked around during signature gathering and took a sample of the voters of our ward. And the 3 issues that I came up with was the sort of affordability basket, and then the second issue was kind of things that the Department of Public Works does, but critical city services and other things like the schools and public safety go under that. And then the third thing that was really important to folks was talking about sort of climate resilience and sustainability. So that's what I've done to sort of center my platform. I'm happy to discuss other issues that have come up from voters as well, but those are the 3 sort of big pushes that I'm running for.
Yeah. So council has been occupied with rezoning quite a bit, and ADUs certainly fit into the mode of affordability in Ithaca. And Pat, you brought up that you would like to see a carve-out for the 3rd Ward to ensure owner-occupied ADUs. And that did come under a little bit of criticism for it being considered exclusionary. So I wondered if you want to take this time to bring up why you believe a carve-out serves the best interests of the 3rd Ward.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And to follow on what Billy was saying, also what my platform is based on is very similar to what you were saying. The 3 areas that I hear most about are essentially taxes or cost of living, zoning, which is this issue, and then infrastructure. Those are the 3 big things that I hear about, and then climate resiliency as well. But those 3 seem to be the primary that I was hearing about. Specifically, zoning is the one we're focusing on now because Common Council is looking forward to, on May 7th, I think it is, they're going to vote on whether to do ADU zoning. And what I discovered is that people don't have a problem with ADUs largely. Mostly everyone agrees on them. The area where there's a sticking point is owner occupancy, and the areas the places that really care is Bell Sherman and South Hill. And it happens to be those are our ward. It's the third ward is Bell Sherman and South Hill. And the reason why it's important to us is we have tremendous pressure from student housing. And so what we've seen over the years is lots of single-family housing getting bought up by outside developers who have deep pockets and can outspend residents. And so it's reducing the housing stock, and it's also incentivizing absentee landlords, which make it worse for the neighborhood. And it's also, they're not good for renters. So South Hill has had a major issue with this. We pushed Common Council to create something called an overlay to stop the infill that was happening of student housing back in 2017, 2018, something like that. And so my vision, and I think it's a very reasonable one, would be to have something similar overlay for the South Hill area, the Bell Sherman area, essentially the third ward, because we are unique in that we have such high student pressure. And I've been a little frustrated with Common Council feeling like they have to take an all or nothing approach. There's no reason why we couldn't have a carve out for the third ward and no owner occupancy for the rest of the city. I don't see any reason why that's the case. You raised the point about there was a couple criticisms of it. One was that it was exclusionary. And happily, that's just simply not true because anyone can live in an owner-occupied area. Renters can live in an owner-occupied area. We happen to have a renter at our house. We're landlords, and we have someone who rents there. And in fact, I think it's a better place because if it's owner-occupied, you're going to have better landlords having good relationships with the neighbors and good relationships with the tenants. So I guess if there's a better explanation of what people meant by exclusionary, I would address that, but my sense is that it's available for anyone. It works to maintain single-family housing stock as well, in my opinion, which we have not done a good job of maintaining. And it makes a better environment for renters. So far from being exclusionary, I think it's much, much better.
Well, I guess they meant exclusionary, meaning one neighborhood would stand out apart from the other neighborhoods.
Oh, certainly it'd be different. That's not exclusion, and that's a different thing. And to me, policy should take in nuance. We are a diverse community. We have diverse neighborhoods with different needs. Ward 1's needs are going to be different than Ward 3's needs. And so we shouldn't try to shove everything into one box. And again, I don't see why they have to do that. So if they're saying there's no reason for there to be a separate policy, I'd say, yeah, there is, because we have these unique circumstances. And that's okay. I think we should embrace the diversity of the different neighborhoods that we have. And that's one of the things that makes Ithaca really cool.
Do you support a carve-out, Billy?
I mean, this is an interesting question to me because I do research for one of my jobs on what is essentially property technology. So it would be, to keep it rather simple, everything from the use of algae to build building blocks to replace concrete, which is super cool, to studying companies like Airbnb and Zillow and how they have utterly destroyed our housing market nationally, right? And I have a very critical take on those. So one example of an owner occupancy requirement that I think was good, that was established in the past, was for the short-term, long-term rentals, right? So this was clearly a circumstance where you were having major investors who were coming in, they were buying up homes, and this happened all across the country. It's a huge pattern of it. And I think that in that case, the evidence is that worked, right? I think for us during this campaign, my take has been slightly different in that I think the current council is going to vote on it, and they're going to vote the way that they're going to vote. And I want to be thinking 2, 3, 4 years down the line, what's going to happen next, right? So what's going to happen next is the Common Council has money, they have funding. to bring in outside advice on zoning regulations for the city. So I would like to see, really robust discussion around those types of zoning regulations with really distinct democratic input, perhaps through the formation of an advisory committee or something like this within the structure of city government. And I would like to start thinking about the types of zoning adjustments that we can get everybody on board with in our ward, right? Because Pat spoke to a lot of voters. I spoke to a lot of voters. I spoke to a couple hundred for the course of the past couple weeks, so a fair amount.
Yeah.
And direct personal contacts. And I found that the people who were really clued in knew about the ADU discussion, and they had a distinct position and were opposed to it. Opposed to not having the owner occupancy.
Opposed to not having owner occupancy.
Well,
Right. But my sort of take is you could ask the question several different ways, and I'm kind of concerned about evidence, right? So in my own lived experience, I understand why owner occupancy, we were just chatting about it before, incentivizes me to maintain my own home, right? I understand that at a deeply personal level. At the same time, I've dug into the economics literature on this, going all the way back to 50s and 60s. And economists are very diligent in that they will find every little detail to try and manipulate and test and things like this. And the most recent, most cited study said that owner occupancy incentivizes maintenance, much like the trend in the literature, but then confessed that the evidence for this was based off of inspectors who had spent less time in owner-occupied homes. So from a pure data perspective, I kind of found, I was struggling with that, because if you're basing the data off of the inspectors spending less time in owner-occupied homes when they're inspecting the homes because they've been told that there's less maintenance, that pollutes the entire data set, right? So, so I think that, just from a data perspective, that was sort of troubling for me, but at the same time, my concentration with this debate has really just been to understand what the council's going to do, what I think that they're going to do, and then understand what the implications of that are, right? So one thing that is not frequently discussed in this sort of debate is the size of the footprint for the ADU unit and the height. I think that the evidence from San Diego, for instance, is very clear that if there's no height restrictions, that's a huge problem, right? Because basically somebody with a lot of money can funnel that money
Well, let's get back to South Hill.
Yeah, sure.
In my opinion, it's pretty dense there already. How are you finding people react to the idea of, well, okay, ADUs might be coming in. Are they comfortable with it? Do they feel like what little space is left might be impinged on?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of mixed, right? And I think, again, it sort of depends on the way that you ask the question, right? Because if you say, we're going to develop this ADU policy, we put in an owner occupancy requirement, and then that owner occupancy requirement, because an ADU is a permanent structure, that it sort of depends the way you could structure the owner occupancy requirement. If you put a release on it at some point, then that reintroduces elasticity into the market, right? Currently, a house can move back and forth between owner-occupied and not owner-occupied, which creates more elasticity and more sort of downward pressure on prices. But if you add that owner occupancy in that, it creates more upward pressure on prices. So I do think that this is something that we have to think about, 3, 4, 5 steps out, but something that I would suggest in terms of thinking about a zoning reform that I think that I've surveyed people sort of across the spectrum here. I would say, our DSA types, right, our liberal moderate, and then our independents, right, our progressives, everybody is kind of on board with the idea that if you have a home We got like 4 postdocs or 5 postdocs, and they want to buy the home together. They're going to live in the home for 4 or 5 years. They should be able to do that, right? So in this discussion, I want to introduce the concept of co-ownership and maybe start talking about that a little bit more as a community, as some type of reform that we could do to introduce a little bit more flexibility into housing.
So let me just clarify, because I kind of got a little lost in what you're saying.
Sure, sure.
So you're against the idea of owner occupancy, and maybe I'm speaking too broadly.
No. I would say it's kind of moot, is my honest. Because
You believe that council's going in a certain direction?
I
and
believe that
largely
council
they're not going to enforce an owner
Right.
occupancy for
Yeah,
ADUs.
yeah. And so what I would say is that it would be best for our energy is to sort of think that what are our next steps going to be as a community, right? How are we going to continue to make adjustments in zoning policy that we can get people to agree with, right?
Right, and so you don't think council would move towards owner occupancy in the future? That's completely off the table, is what I'm hearing.
I'm counting I've scrum board, right? I've sort of counted it out a couple different ways with the way that people have patterned their votes, and I've done sort of, I've looked back at the meetings for the past 3.5 years, and I expect that Common Council is going to enact the ADU policy without.
No, that I understand, but you're saying if we're going to look forward, you're
Yeah.
saying that's not something we should look at. We should look at an entirely different thing.
I would encourage us to think about a number of different reforms and things like that, that we think that we can get folks in our neighborhoods on board with, that help mediate some of the tensions between our neighborhoods and the rest of the city.
I feel strongly about owner occupancy. I think that's going to resolve a lot of the issues that South Hill's facing. I think even if Common Council votes it down this time, I would be happy to try to do something about that in the future. And on a side note that's related to this, but not really, one of the reasons why I would like to join Common Council is that I think I've seen them do a lot of legislation that is not taking everyone's interests into account. And it's really frustrating. And that you're not unreasonably saying, they're just going to vote the way they're going to vote is, sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
Yeah.
But in the sense that they're probably not going to give Ward 3 a carve out or take that into account. That really bothers me. And that's just sort of a side note. But I think Common Council's been doing a lot of legislation that's sort of all or nothing.
Well, let's touch on that side note, because
Yeah.
that was a question
Yeah.
in this special hearing, public hearing. Council definitely seemed to defer to the professionals that spoke, on the planning committee and the zoning, and they even said so when it came time to comment. So I'm wondering, as representatives, where do you find that balance between many of the people spoke from their own lived experience and the professionals spoke from their expertise, if you will? Where do you find that balance when you're on council?
I would definitely defer to, I always defer to experts in an area where I don't feel like I'm not relatively well informed, and I would defer to them on this issue as well. One of the things in the report did say that most of the communities that had ADUs also had owner occupancy as a best practice at the time, as well as things like height limitations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that also gives me reason to think like, they did thorough research on that. But to answer your question in short, I would definitely defer to experts, but ultimately I am representing the constituency. And so that's really going to be the bottom line. The experts are going to help guide it, but we need to make sure that we are addressing the concerns of the Third Ward.
Yeah. I think that this intuition that Pat has is very good, right? In my approach to my campaign, I've tried to put voters first. And one of the reasons for that is because I think that there's a lot of people who don't feel included in democratic processes. And I feel like there's a lot of people impacted by the national political climate who feel very shook, for lack of a better term, by the direction of the country. And so my sentiment was to try to empathize with the voters and really put their concerns first, gather those first, and then build from there, and then see how we can work together with experts. So you brought up this report that Common Council put out, right? And the height requirements were very important. That was an important part of that report. You know, I was happy as a researcher to see those in there. Subsequently, or right around the same time, the Brookings Institute put out a report that said they did a study of these different cities that had enacted owner occupancy, and their study was basically that the evidence was that it removed elasticity from the market and put upward pressure on prices. So, you know, I think that there's a balance that needs to be struck there. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, we are going to defer to expert opinion. We want to show respect for expertise and evidence, and that's very important in terms of the climate of Common Council. But I would say that my approach is very much to ask what the voters want first, and then to bring that to experts.
Okay. Let's stick with South Hill a bit, and I want to bring up Southworks. Okay. Niels Bone from IURA recently gave a report and said the buildings are significantly contaminated still with VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So this has been a brownfield, and the remediation has been going on for almost 20 years, if not more. Do we think it's realistic and safe to really consider that there can be a whole village put into that spot, into that place?
Do you want to?
Sure, yes. Yes, I do. But I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of money to make that happen. And so I know one of the concerns that a lot of residents had with the Southworks project had to do with tax abatements, because there's large tax abatements associated with it. And I definitely resonate with the sense that people are feeling cheated, especially when our taxes go up and you're seeing these businesses look like they're getting a free ride. However, from a sort of pragmatic point of view, in order to make this a useful property, it's going to take a lot of money and a huge amount of investment. And so no developer is going to take that on unless they have some upfront cost reductions. So I think it is possible. I think it's going to take a lot of money, and I think we've started at the right steps to try to make that happen. And I think it's really important for growing our overall tax base, actually, because a lot of homes are going to be part of that project, and for developing South Hill.
Yeah. I like a lot of what you said there, right? Especially in terms of thinking critically about tax abatements. I hear this a lot from voters. We're both educators at the end of the day, right? Schools are funded by taxes. The classic criticism is that when you give a tax abatement, that is money out of the public school system, right? And there's a balance there. As I've done a bit of reading about this site, and have you visited it?
Not recently.
Okay, I did. So, you know, I think it's important to visit, right, and to get a sense. And I also studied a fair amount about this site. I grew up in an area that was nearby an EPA Superfund site. And we were very fortunate in that this was remediated, it was cleaned up, and it was an old copper mine that was turned into a solar farm at the end of the day. But it took 25 years, something like that, to get there with a fully functional environmental protection agency, which I hate to be the canary in the coal mine here.
You hate to just point out the fact
that I don't know if everybody has checked up on Project 2025's platform recently, but I think there's a sense of chaos at this sort of national level, and people feel that. I want to impart on folks that there is actually a plan behind that chaos, and that plan is Project 2025. So I feel like as local representatives, we need to be clued into that plan. We need to be tracking it. We need to be tracking the way that the financing of those plans is going to impact our local community. So you brought up the point of the idea of a housing development up there, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Housing Supply Fund at the federal level.
No.
I'm going to keep the numbers simple. It's about $50 billion a year. Some of it goes into those tax incentive programs. It's about $1 billion per state. New York's going to get more because it's bigger economy, but keep it simple, it's about $1 billion per state. They want to cut that by $45 billion. That reduces that fund down to about the size of the city budget for the state of New York, as opposed to $1 billion. So I think that things like that are going to have an impact on the financial feasibility of Southworks. Right? This puts us in an exceptionally difficult position because the way that the Southworks agreement is structured is that the developers are, to keep it simple, on the hook for a lot of the remediation as it comes up. Chainworks is, to keep it simple, on the hook for TCE, right? That's sort of the original pollutant that was flagged. But some other pollutants, PCBs, right, which are chemically similar to dioxins, which I find very troubling. As somebody with experience working in Vietnam in the past as an educator, that is on the hook. The developers are on the hook for that. So I think that although the 5-year agreements may not be up again until the end of the term that we are both running for, I think that there's a sort of social responsibility for folks to be up on what is happening with that site, to be a source of information for the public.
Would you recommend a family member consider living up there?
Not presently, no.
Once it was, say, remediated, to shift capital word into DEC's word?
I do not have the professional qualifications to tell you what that remediation looks like. And that's an area where I think that we really need to be deferring to the expertise of environmental scientists in particular to give us an accurate presentation of what the timeline should be.
Okay. Well, flood maps have been an issue, and I don't think it's such an issue with your ward, but there was an interesting thing that came up, and bear with me, it takes a little bit of explaining. At one of the council meetings, I think it was the planning department person, they brought up that FEMA has a scoring system for communities. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
A certain number of points. If you mitigate flood hazards, your residents can get certain savings on their flood insurance. And the higher points went to things like not building in a floodplain or leaving open spaces. And the planning department person sort of dismissed that out of hand and said, well, no, we can't get to that level, but we can get to these lower levels. So I'm asking you, where do we find that line to draw between environmental sustainability and development? Because this seemed clearly to point out there has to be, or in these people's minds, there is a line to draw. And it seems to be going more towards development.
Yeah, do you want it?
Sure. Yes, I ended up being at that meeting. I don't remember why, but I stuck around for that, and it was really interesting. And I would say it does impact our ward, not specifically because of we're not in the flood zone, but it's going to drive up overall property prices because essentially, like the big thing that's going to happen is that in June 17th or something, when those flood maps get realized, a bunch more houses are going to be required to have insurance, flood insurance. And then that gets passed on to renters, it gets passed on to owners, it just becomes very, very expensive very quickly. That's one of the big pressures our city's facing. And so this project, this is the first time I'd ever heard of this particular program. And I think that what the people giving the presentation I think I would have deferred to their experience on that. I think they did a good job of explaining why essentially going between, I'll make up some arbitrary number, so between like a 4 and a 5.
Right.
What they were getting at was essentially the cost. It was a big cost balance, cost
Benefit?
Thank you. Cost benefit analysis. You know what I meant. Cost benefit analysis. And they said, we could put this much money into raising houses up, for example, or trying to clear out open space or reduce development. And this is how much we'll save in terms of overall insurance costs. And once you go from like 4 to 5, it just gets really, really skewed. And so basically, it seemed like you would be spending a lot of money for the city to try to go into those upper tiers. And I think there's probably more economical ways for us to approach environmental considerations than this. This to me is more of a trying to keep housing costs reasonable. That's how I would look at this.
Okay, well, I didn't think there was much cost associated with leaving open space or not building on a floodplain.
Well,
That
it's
just
not
seemed to
currently
be-
there. We'd have to create it.
Yeah.
I mean, create the open space.
Yeah, we would have to intentionally leave lots vacant.
Yes.
We would have to let houses that are kind of going to seed continue to go to seed.
Yeah, or remove them. Yeah,
Or remove
just
them
make
as
them
they
not
get-
usable
yeah, yeah.
areas, and it would be, yeah.
It's I mean, I think I agree with your perspective that if we're really focused on environmental issues, there are some other ways to address environmental issues. I do think that this is a housing issue. One of my sort of forward-thinking topics of discussion that I would like to introduce is it time for us to look at measures that prevent insurance companies from fleeing our community? I hate to bring it up.
No, if you could do it.
Yeah, I mean, they have done, I mean, there's sort of the.
You got a plan.
I hate to bring it up, right? I do not have the legal expertise to enact that, but this is something that we have seen in California.
Yeah.
Right? I think this is going to be an issue for us with the floodplain. And in 50 years, unfortunately, it could be an issue for us in terms of fires and things like that, right? And so I think that, in terms of investing in floodplain development, something that I would like to see from our ward is maybe a little bit more sort of communal discussion and focus around the fact, and I think a lot of people are on board with this, the idea that we are quite literally upstream. And so the way that we manage our drainage as a community impacts the rest of the city. And I'm not the type of person who's going to be like, and I've got a plan for that, right? But I think that we could come up with one together as long as we're sort of centering that as a question of debate and discussion moving forward.
Well, I want to say I appreciate the sentiment of, say, preserving open space, but there may be some more beneficial open space for the ecosystem that wouldn't be in the middle of downtown or something like that.
Right.
That's where I would focus that.
Yeah, perhaps sort of keeping like Mulholland
Yes, the
Wildflower
Preserve or
Preserve,
something
like
like that.
not encroaching on
Yeah.
that would be,
That would make sense to me.
that's really
Yeah.
important. Right?
Okay. Well, let's see. Kind of moving on from the third ward, unless there's other issues specific to the third ward you guys would like to bring up.
I mean, I think basically the property taxes, but that's citywide, and if we're going to get to that, we'll get to it. But that's.
Okay. Do you have ideas on how to
That's a
lessen
good
or at least not increase property taxes?
So I've got
Go ahead,
yeah. So
You're on this, I know.
they're not perfect, and it's really hard because the expenses that we incurred, a lot of that was due to labor costs, which I think everyone, including myself,
City of Ithaca labor costs.
yeah, like we needed. It's just going to happen. But the property increases were dramatic. very, very dramatic. And so the two issues I saw with that was, one, the whole process last year was not done very well. It felt very opaque. It caught people off guard. They didn't really just start discussing it until, like, say, October. The final meeting, the final public meeting to talk about this was the day after the election, when basically everyone was in public mourning and didn't want to drag themselves out of bed and come to common council and beg for them not to raise their property tax in double digits. So anyways, that whole process, I think, was done poorly. And currently, there are three alderpersons: Alderperson Fabrizio, Alderperson Brown, and Alderperson Shapiro, from three different wards. Shapiro's our ward, who have put forward a resolution to ask Common Council to have a budget committee that can participate in the budget process starting now and going forward. And I would really like to see, in fact, I'll bring this up at the next Common Council meeting, I'd like to see that happen, because it's going to be very difficult for us to get away from taxes. That's just really hard, especially as we keep losing more property to Cornell, who just bought an apartment on College Ave. So being able to inform people, it's going to be a little bit better. Maybe it will come up with some solutions that we aren't thinking about, but I really want to see more transparency in the budgetary process. I think that's extremely important. The other thing is, Margaret Fabrizio as well, just got to keep giving a shout out to her. She has suggested there's some legislation in the Senate that would potentially use, New York State has some discretionary funding that's given to municipalities, and there's an idea of looking at it for doing property tax exemption offsets. So if you've got a city where over 58% of your property tax is tax exempt, maybe the state could kick in, and that's more long term. And so but it's something. And lastly, I'll say, and this is also another shout out to my neighbor Emily Thuja. We have not had our audits completed since, for 3 years. We have no bond rating, which means that we're paying extra interest, unnecessary interest. The city is working on that. I will acknowledge that, but I think that took a little more pushing than it should have to do some easy cost savings. On to you.
Yeah. So property taxes. I'm going to bring it back to property taxes. So property taxes are something that we talk about personal experience and things like this, right? If you are a new homeowner, you are very worried about your property taxes going up. And the reason for this is also statistical, right? New homeowners, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, are increasingly purchasing at the top of their affordability margins, 30, 40, 50%, right? And that's pre-tax income. If you do it post-tax, sometimes it's even a lot more, right? Unfortunately, the way that our property taxes are structured, it's not just a city issue, right?
Right.
And the way that we deal with that has been through property assessments, right? And property assessments involve the county, right? And it's a lot of work to do a property assessment. Typically, a property assessment has only occurred every 2 to 3 years on average for most municipalities across the country. That's been standard, right? What happened in the city of Ithaca, just to add some additional sort of detailed insight to what Pat described, which I agree with generally. What happened was that housing values had gotten so juiced during the pandemic. You saw houses regularly going when we were purchasing, right? I was doing market research at the same time because I'm kind of a nerd like that. Houses were going for 15, 20% over asking regularly. When houses are going for 15 to 20% over asking regularly, that is the primary driver of property tax increases in the bottom line. The city budget isn't going to do anything people working on the city budget can't reduce the tax rate, although they did technically reduce the tax rate, right? They reduced the tax rate. So they did cut the tax rate because the impact of that was that and there's been a little bit of misinformation of this around, the average property tax bill went up about 13%.
13, 14, yeah.
But it was highly differential based off value of properties.
Right.
Right? So if a property jumped in value a lot, then that bill went up pretty high. And I did speak to one voter who I spoke to them in detail about the value of their property, their perceived value of the property, the previous assessed value of the property. They are now informed about how to challenge that. There was a process to challenge that. They were already pretty informed, and I think that they'll do okay with that, right? There's a process for that. I think more broadly, people in the past have been told that if you just do development, there's going to be some supply side downward pressure on property taxes. Again, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but once prices go up, they are not a thing that is coming back down, right? So what we're really talking about in this is attempting to stabilize the increases, right? And we do have some demand side mechanisms to do that. And that includes what is administered through counties, Section 8, right? It's a federal program through HUD, although that's also
questionable.
and that's on the chopping. There are parts of that that are on the chopping block, and there are other parts where they're trying to restrict the benefits to exclude green card holders and all kinds of like absolutely heinous stuff. But there are some demand side measures. And then there are some supply side measures. We've talked about tax abatements. There's the low income housing tax credit, which again is part of that housing affordability supply fund at the federal level. So we're going to face real challenges and when it comes to property taxes in the future. You know, if I were dreaming, I would say let's have progressive property taxes. There aren't great legal mechanisms to do that, right? But, you know, I think that one of the things that we have to think about in terms of balance here is as the need to provide city workers with the proper pay and benefits to do their jobs increases, we have to be mindful about the expenditures that we're making in the city budget, right? And we have to prioritize the needs of our ward, right? And I think that a lot of the needs of our ward come down to essentially fully staffing and funding the Department of Public Works.
Yep.
Right? That's
a big one.
That is probably the big one. So maybe we should talk about that.
You're finding problems with infrastructure?
Well, there have been, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just infrastructure. I want to speak about it more broadly. That, you know, infrastructure is part of this. The Department of Public Works is a very, very large department in our city. In fact, it's the largest. And they also do things like manage the parks and things like that, right? And I think that there is, speaking of community sort of mediation, there's room there to take groups at college campuses and get them involved because they are required to make volunteer commitments, get them involved with the Department of Public Works to do some green up in city parks and things like that, right? And that alleviates some of the pressure on that department. And then means that that department can focus a bit more on things like repairing sidewalks in front of folks' homes, which, you know, on Giles Street, for instance, there's a strip there that is, I would consider unsafe. The voters in that area have mentioned to me that it's unsafe, you know, and it would be important to get that.
Totally.
But there's a lot of stuff that is covered by the Department of Public Works that's, you know, there's very minor things that would make our lives better that I think folks, you know, should be on board with accomplishing, right? These are really small things. Like, for instance, one voter mentioned to me, right across from the police station, right? Right as we're going up South Hill, right there's that crosswalk there. A lot of walking commuters use that crosswalk. There are no flashing lights there, right? So the question from the voter is, hey, can we get some flashing lights there? I think the police department might like it also, right? And this feels like manageable stuff for the Department of Public Works, right?
So other candidates have brought up that in lieu of looking at taxes, people feel like they'd like to get more out of city services rather than necessarily diminish their taxes. Is this a position that you're basically taking? Is that people should be able to feel more that their government is doing for them and they won't be so adamant about taxes not
Yeah.
increasing?
Yeah, totally. I mean,
Well, I'd like to hear from Pat.
No,
sorry.
sorry. I made a face.
No,
Do you
go
mind
ahead.
just rephrasing that real quick?
Yeah,
I mean, I think
So
I
in
understand.
talking
what
to
I'm
other
into.
candidates,
Yeah.
they feel that rather than focusing so much on stabilizing or even lowering taxes, try to give them better city services that affect their lives more positively, that they're getting more bang for the buck out of the city than perhaps they are now.
So my experience is that that's a really hard sell for our ward. When you feel like you're being, essentially when you feel like you don't have any money and you may have to move, city services don't do anything. So a lot of folks, especially at the Common Council meeting that talked about this, they said, hey, I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford to live here. So the idea of getting more city services for your tax is just not helpful for these folks. I'll also point out that when we passed the Just Cause legislation, one of the restrictions in that was that landlords couldn't raise rents more than 10%. I mean, that was like sort of the cap. And we raised property taxes on average 14%. Of course, there's outliers to that. I heard 30% as one,
That one's being
that's
challenged.
one, yeah.
That's being challenged,
Good.
for sure.
And you're right, that is due to valuation, but it's real money. So if people understand that, like, if renters can't accept a 14% increase in their costs, it's hard for me to expect homeowners to expect it and then just say, well, maybe we can give you more services. There is a line where it's not disposable income. So I'd say it's a really hard sell for my ward, for our ward.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just want to. It was funny. I was thinking that the way that you expressed that, Tom, I heard that from so many people.
In your ward?
So many people.
Okay.
And again, I'm trying to do the sort of beginner's mind approach of shed my preconceptions, shed my personal motivations, right? Shed, what I've done in terms of research, and just go out and ask people, meet them where they're at, ask them what their number one priorities are. And the way that you phrased it, a lot of folks in our ward are pretty comfortable. The median income is much higher than it is for the rest of the city, right? If you look at the average degree attainment, it is much higher. So when you're speaking to homeowners in our ward, I think statistically, you are much more likely to run into an opinion that says, my life is pretty good, but I'm looking at my bill and I want to get more for it, right? I don't see where the money is going, so to speak, right? And that may relate to some concerns about transparency that you've talked before, but essentially it's that, right? I'm paying into this, I would like to get more for it. And I think that the way that we handle that is really, it's a labor and materials thing, right? I love democratic processes, I love committees and this type of thing. Committees aren't, so to speak, going to fix the potholes, right? We can have a debate about how to fix the potholes, or we can fund the Department of Works and give them the staff to fix the potholes, right? So that would be where my number one priority is right now. We're also, this hasn't come up yet, Commissioner, as far as I understand,
The new DPW?
The DPW
Commissioner is retiring?
Yes.
Has retired?
I think it's in the process.
In the process of retiring?
Yeah.
There was a
Little bit
party
down the road.
recently,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
There was a
yeah.
little shindig.
Yeah.
Right? So, I think in terms of priorities right now, it's really staffing,
Sure.
right? Staffing the Department of Public Works, making sure that they have the materials that they need.
Okay. We only have a few minutes left. Let's talk about serving on council. Now, there has been a certain amount of frustration with this new system of city manager and mayor, where many council members feel like they just don't have much input into what's going on with the city. They're supposedly policy directed, but if they're kind of concerned with how things are running in the city, they're more or less feeling kind of shut out from the process. So I'm wondering how you would serve as council people, knowing that you're really limited to establishing policy and you're really not supposed to be influencing the day-to-day goings-ons with the city. And can you effectively represent ward members if that is the case?
Yeah, I'll
wanna
start.
start?
I would say I like that. I'm 100% behind that. And the reason why is because a while ago, Green Star, which I'm on the board of, adopted a similar sort of policy. Because one of the issues we constantly ran into was the board was interfering with work that operations was doing. And the board was not hired or skilled to do work of operations. And so it ended up creating a lot of friction and problems and inefficiency and all that sort of stuff. And so I see this model is pretty similar. I think the important thing to remember is that Common Council has the ultimate authority. Like, they are the deciders. By making policy, you are doing that. Giving a nice distance to the city manager to do the day-to-day work so that Common Council can focus on policies, which is their job, rather than micromanaging, I think is really important. And micromanaging might be a strong term. I don't necessarily mean that they were trying to do that, but that sort of thing. So we focus on developing policies. They focus on executing it. We keep track of whether they're executing our policies in the way that we see fit. If they're not, we go back and we revamp the policies, and it is a much smoother process. It also allows us to focus on the important things like representing our constituencies. I'd say the bigger issue with Common Council isn't that, but that Common Council's gotten very divisive recently. There's been some really unfortunate situations that have come up. If you've watched the meetings over the last couple of years, or the last year, I think.
Or 3.5 or more. Yeah. We can go back to the beginning of the YouTube videos for evidence here. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate. And so I want to take a much more sort of community approach in that, one, I want to have respect for all councils and all council members, all alderpersons in all wards. I want to try, it's very important to me to develop good relationships with council members and to work with them so that they can help me out when I see something that's very important for our ward. This whole owner occupancy thing, I really think that there's space for this to occur. I'm not optimistic that it will happen, but I think with the right person on council, they could talk to other council members, and there could be more what I call community-based legislation. Instead of an all-or-nothing approach, let's try to listen to each ward, see what their needs are, and come to a more or less a consensus about that. Something that's going to respect all the constituency. And as I said before, some of the legislation that's come through, I think I had the same feeling about the good cause legislation, which became very narrow and required everyone above one tenant. It just seemed rather excessive and again, unnecessary. And there's a lot of people who gave some pushback to that. And I would have liked to see a more balanced approach. And so that's the issue I see. But the whole structure, I think it's a good structure from my vantage point.
Okay.
It's a long
Do you
answer.
have thoughts about this?
I do.
Okay, good.
Figured
you would.
I do. Done a little research.
Really?
Yeah. So, shocker, I know.
I know.
So there's a number of debates about mixed models for city governance, right? And the way that city governance is structured. And the way that Ithaca has gone as a city is relatively unique in terms of having a city manager and a mayor. I know that Alderperson Shapiro brought forward a proposal to further his idea, although perhaps I disagreed with him on some of the details and motivations, which is fine. But his idea was an attempt at democratization, right? So what I did was I researched the city's structure, and I thought, where can we increase democratic input in this structure to support some of those concerns coming from other alderpersons? I've spoken with alderpersons, intentionally reached out to alderpersons who are currently students because I wouldn't necessarily normally speak to them in my day-to-day, right? But, I thought that was a very important perspective to attempt to mediate, right? And I think that in terms of the structure of having the city manager sort of do the budgetary work and then bring elements of the budget up to the council, and then individual members raise amendments and so forth. I think in terms of democratic principles, that works relatively well in terms of oversight and things like that, just sort of pure democracy, right? The area where I would like to see sort of adjustments to governments is we've talked about committees and boards, inactive ones, active ones. I'd love to see one on housing policy. I think that would be a good, it's an issue that is often a struggle for our city and members of different wards with very different motivations. I think that would be a good one for us to try to come together as a community. Another one that I would like to see, I mean, we haven't talked about this yet, but we both have labor backgrounds, right? Another one I'd like to see is some type of sort of labor council on city governance, right? Labor leaders are democratically elected already, right? And if we had a labor council, some type of labor advisory relations council, I think that would be a very good step for our city, especially as we attempt to navigate the next 4 years.
I believe there is a labor liaison in the
It's
works.
kind of a liaison, right?
But not what you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like an advisory committee
And I think
type
that-
things
that-
that kind of formalizes that structure, because there's already this kind of labor coalition of the
Right.
7 different unions in the city and the other sort of proto-organizations and movements that we have going on in different workplaces, Green Star and Cornell and IC, right? And so I think that it's not a big lift for us as a community to put that forward, to get that democratic input, get that next extra step, do things like maybe unite around, you brought up just cause for renters, but I would say just cause for employees, right, for labor.
Oh, yeah.
Just cause for labor, like, you know, I think we could agree on that, right? And I think that that would be very, very meaningful.
And I wanted to correct myself. I meant good cause. I'm constantly saying the wrong thing.
That's
Yes. I meant
okay.
good cause legislation, which is having to do with renters. Just cause is, obviously, that's going to be my default. So,
Yeah.
yes, good cause is what I meant.
Yeah, but to bring
Right.
to bring it back, I think that that's an improvement that we could put forward. We're already in agreement on this, right? We could start getting other wards, input from other wards, and we could say, hey, this is a democratic process. This is something we support, right? And we can start to form community consensus around that.
Okay. Well, we do have to wrap up. Very briefly, is there anything you guys would like to contribute or say about what you are seeing for the future that you hope you can have an influence in paving the way for Ithaca, not just your ward, but Ithaca as a whole?
I guess this is where we'll see a difference. I'm very focused on the short term. So I'm really focused on the upcoming. The two things to me are the zoning legislation that's currently being proposed, and then also seeing some committees being put forward, like the one regarding the budget. And I like the idea of putting forward some other committees, because we haven't had a lot. So that's really my main focus area. And then trying to come up with some way of wrangling of either increasing income through maybe sales revenue or, yeah, property tax is just tricky because of Cornell. So something along those lines. I mean, that's going to be, to me, our biggest issues are going to be financial going forward. And that's what I would be focused on.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of. So I think in terms of long-term vision, on a personal level, I am going to be motivated deeply to think, you know, I'm in a 28-year time plan right now, right? So I am thinking long-term. But in terms of this campaign, I'm thinking about what can meaningfully be accomplished in the next 4 years. We've sort of danced around this issue of Cornell. I work at Cornell, familiar with the budgetary issues. You've got a $5.7 billion operating budget, and then building buildings that are structured through endowments and donor funded, that are single buildings that are the size of the city budget annually, right? At the same time, I think it's very important to be in tune with the campus movements that are attempting to put pressure on the Cornell administration to do things like do emergency spend downs of their endowments, do emergency bond borrowing and things like this to shore up their grant funded positions, because those are also going to open up avenues for organizations like the Ithaca Teachers Association, which has been making this campaign and ask, we're warming up to Slope Day, right? Has been making this campaign that says, hey, we should be contributing more to the city budget. Something that will come up during our cycle is the TCAT agreement. That will come up during the service, right? And
Is it 3 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that will come up. So there will
Right.
be a chance there to, regardless of what anybody thinks in terms of Cornell's tax-exempt status or not, I know that people have become more adverse to critiquing that because of the national climate right now that's been really... I'm speaking about the folks who work there.
Yeah.
Right? And the folks who are, like librarians who are endowment funded.
Right.
Right? Now, most workers like myself are not librarians at the library, but there are a lot of folks who are endowment funded, so the energy on that has been shifting. But when it comes to TCAT, I think there's an opportunity coming up within the next 4 years to get Cornell to contribute more towards TCAT in a way that is reasonable and in a way that addresses the fact that a lot of their workers rely on TCAT to get to work, including from our ward and from parts of, And I think that we should be thinking about not just Cornell's memorandum of understanding, but these other memorandums of understanding, and sort of thinking about if there's a large development, for instance, Southwark, maybe we should get a memorandum of understanding from them, right, to get them to contribute towards that as well. Might be a big lift, but we should be having these type of discussions in order to be forward-thinking.
Okay. Well, on that note, seems like all roads do lead back to Cornell, more or less. But,